Welcome to session 4 in our lecture on international political economy. This week we'll cover the last 75 years of the developments in international political economy, and you cannot discuss these 75 years without discussing the concept of globalization. Thus, this week's unofficial subtitle is going to be One World Out of Many. In the bigger picture of our lecture, we're now in session 4, which is, of course, the last part of the historical part of a lecture, and in the coming weeks we'll discuss aspects of international political economy as it is today. And among these aspects are two that you addressed quite frequently in your questions, namely questions of international trade and question of the global financial system. So if I could not answer these questions so far, just be a little bit patient and wait for the sessions next week and in 4 weeks when we'll discuss exactly these questions. So today's session will be structured as follows. First, I will briefly sketch the concept of globalization and the history of globalization. Then I will discuss how the last 75 years played out very roughly if we talk about it in the concept of worlds. Then I will take up the thread from last week where I introduced the notion of capitalism and differentiate it a little bit to discuss different forms of capitalism, or as we might say, different capitalisms. In the fourth part, I'll discuss questions of international organizations and global governance. And at the end, as usual, I'll briefly sketch the main innovations of these last 75 years in international political economy. So let's talk about globalization. So what is globalization? You'll find a lot of definitions of globalization, some of them focused on the economy only, some of them wider. I choose this definition. Here we would say globalization is a process in which national borders lose some of their relevance for human activities in the spheres of economics, politics, and or culture. And I highlighted two words here, namely the words of process and some, because sometimes these definitions are misinterpreted and then people say, well, look, national borders are still relevant, so there is no globalization. However, globalization does not mean that national borders lose all of their relevance. It only refers to a process in which their relevance is shrinking. And you can observe these processes very well, as I will explain later. So the idea is that in the world, in all our actions, national borders restrain our actions in some kind of way. We tend to act within our national borders rather than beyond national borders. And this relevance of national borders in the process of globalization diminishes, which, for example, for you means that maybe in a less globalized world you would be less likely to study abroad, but in today's more globalized world you are more likely to study abroad. As I already said, the notion of globalization is quite often mainly used to talk about processes in the sphere of economics. This is because this is where this notion comes from. And if you speak about globalization in the sphere of economics, you would ask, okay, which human activities in the sphere of economics could be more or less shaped by national borders? Typically, we talk about three aspects of economics, or of three different flows in economics. On the one hand, we have the flow of goods and services, which relates to trade. So in a more globalized world, there will be more international trade. More trade will move beyond borders rather than only be within one nation. Secondly, we have an increase in the flow of capital, or in the transnational flow of capital, which means that more investments take place transnationally. So investors from one country do not invest all of their money in their own country, but rather take it and invest it somewhere abroad because they hope they will make more profit there, or because they want to diversify their portfolio so that if there's a crisis in one country, they don't lose all their profits, but only some of them. Thirdly, you can also talk about an increase in the flow of labor, which, and this might be not what we would think like in common sense, means migration. So, from an economist's perspective, if you see human beings crossing border, you would mostly think, well, there's labor power crossing the border. So you have these three economic activities that increasingly transcend national borders. You can also think of other human activities in the economics. You could think of a transnationalization of production and of corporations. So we have more transnational corporations that are not only fixed in one country, but that are active in many countries. And also we have transnational production chains where not only raw materials from one country are imported to another country and are then used there to manufacture goods, but rather that the whole manufacturing process is distributed across many countries, so that in the end you can hardly say in which country this product was made. In the field of politics, we often talk about globalization in the sense that economic globalization is happening and now we need globalized politics in order to frame this economic globalization. So then economic globalization is seen as some kind of fate, and now politics has to react to it, and national politics is not well equipped to react to global economic development, because then all the countries act on their own while the corporations might be transnationalized. This is not the very best picture because, for example, globalization did not just happen. It was facilitated by national governments, so it's no fate, but it's something that was made happen. However, it is right that globalization in the economy also requires some kind of globalized politics. And what we talk about then is what we also call global governance. This means that decision-making processes are in part moved from the national level, from the responsibility of national governments, to some supranational levels, to international organizations, where there is more coordination and where decisions can take into account international developments. Thirdly, in the sphere of culture, or you could also say in the sphere of society, we can also see an increase in the transnational dissemination of cultural forms and practices. I already mentioned the possibility to study abroad maybe, but you can also think of cultural products such as TV shows maybe, so that many people across the world maybe know the same TV shows from HBO or Netflix. However, two caveats have to apply here. First, these globalized cultural products are often disseminated in localized forms. So on the one hand, we have TV shows like maybe Game of Thrones, which is broadcast pretty much in the same way all across the globe. Then, however, we have other kind of TV shows which are only disseminated in their localized forms. If you think of TV shows like America Got Talent, there you have a TV show that is created in the United States, and then you have a very similar TV show with maybe the same creators even in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in all kind of other countries, because the audiences there, they wouldn't be interested in watching the American show, but they are interested in watching a show of the same format with a German touch maybe. So you have these kind of things. So globalization in culture often comes with localization. Secondly, and this particularly goes to the Westerners among you, don't be so quick to assume that it's Western culture that is disseminated all over the globe. You can make this case when it comes to movies. You can also make this case when it comes to sports maybe. In sports, many of us think, well, everybody plays soccer. It's not really true. There's probably soccer in every country, but it's not the most important sport in every country. We maybe have the North American sports sphere where baseball and football, or what's called football there, and hockey and basketball are the most important sports. Then we have much of the rest of the world, like South America and Europe and Africa, where probably soccer is the most important sport, and then you have a big part of the world where cricket is the most important sport. And this includes one of the biggest countries in the world, namely India, but also a few other countries from the former British Empire. So don't be too quick to assume that only American or Western cultural goods are globalized. So when did globalization happen, and to what extent did it happen? If you talk about globalization, you typically have someone in a room saying, well, there's nothing new, there was always globalization, so why do people talk about this as if it's something that only started in the 90s? And this is kind of right, but it's not fully right. Because it is true, we have had some forms of globalization as long as we had colonization and as long as we had capitalism. However, it's not a process that's happening to the same amount all of the time. Rather, we have certain waves of globalization. To the right, you see a diagram from the World Bank from 2002, which is a little bit old, but it still holds because it's mostly an historic diagram. And what you see here is the globalization measured for the three economic measures that I just mentioned. So the flow of trade, the flow of investment, and the flow of migration. And in all three dimensions, you see that we had one first wave of globalization in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century. So in the heyday of imperialism, there was a lot of migration going on, mainly migration from Europe to the United States. There was a lot of international investment going on, mainly from European countries to their colonies. And there was also a lot of international trade going on. But then this wave of globalization collapsed at some point around World War One, and then with the Great Depression, it almost came to a halt, and we had some deglobalization. So there was less trade, less international investment, and also less migration. And then we had what is sometimes called the Fordist intermission. So this was a time when we had a Fordist economy, so mainly in the industrial countries of the time, we had a type of production that aimed at mass consumption, but mainly at mass consumption in the country where production took place. And at this time we had not so much international trade, not so much international investment, and not so much migration. And this also coincides with the heyday of Keynesianism, and it also is what is sometimes referred to as embedded liberalism. And this is also what I called in session 1 the golden age of capitalism. But then this system came into crisis in the 1970s, and then a liberalization took place, and we had two further waves of globalization. They are not very easily discerned in this diagram, but it makes sense to distinguish them, because in the 1970s we had some globalization that was mainly among Western countries and among parts of what was then called the Third World or the developing world. And in the 1990s ongoing, we had a new wave, because now it also included China, and it also included the former Soviet bloc. So there were two further waves of globalization, but however, you see that the amount of globalization is by many measures not much higher than it was in 1900. So in global trade, it is higher, but when it comes to migration, at least to the United States, it's not much more. And also when it comes to international investment in developing countries, it's also not much more. And what we might be seeing right now, but this is debatable and this is a developing situation, is a possible renationalization, or maybe another deglobalization, or at least a process in which globalization is decelerated. We see this with the trade war between the United States and China and then the European countries. And if you remember the diagram that I showed you on international trade in the very first session of our lecture, then you saw that already in 2019 world trade did not grow anymore, so it came to a halt and it didn't grow. It didn't shrink already. It probably gonna shrink this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But we still have to see whether there will be a full-blown renationalization or only a deceleration of globalization, or maybe with a new US president, maybe we will just resume the old course of globalization. We still have to see that. So, bottom line is, globalization is a real thing. It's something that makes sense to talk about, but it's not something that is only very new. Rather, we had different waves of globalization and deglobalization. In the next part, I'll discuss the same processes with an angle that is a little bit wider. You maybe remember this map that I showed you 2 weeks ago. And this map represents what we might call the many worlds of 1400. As you probably remember, I made the case and did not convince all of you that there was nothing special about Europe in 1400. And if there was nothing special about Europe, Europe was just one of many regional economies in the world out there, and each of these economies, we could say, was a world of their own. And some of these worlds were interconnected, like those of Eurasia and Africa. Some of these worlds were disconnected from these worlds, like those in the Americas, but there were many worlds. Next, I showed you this map, which represents what we might want to call the European world before 1945. What we see here is a number of European countries represented in purple, dominating the rest of the world, mainly represented in green. As I said back then, and as I say today again, we have to handle this map with care. We have to think about that it's complicated having Russia in purple there, and we have to think that not all of the green countries were ever colonized at the same point. So the Americas already were colonized before most of the countries in Africa and Asia became colonized. However, very roughly we can say that somewhere between 1400 and 1945, European countries dominated most of the rest of the world, particularly in the 1800s. However, this domination did not hold forever. We see processes in which power shifted from Europe to other parts of the world, mainly first to the United States and to Japan, which also industrialized, but then also to what was Russia before and then became the Soviet Union. And in addition to that, many of the colonies that were still colonies developed means to resist their colonial domination. So decolonization happened and this European world collapsed. What we had for the next 45 years, from 1945 to 1990, is what one might call three worlds. This notion is a little bit complicated. It was developed by the French ethnologist Alfred Sauvy. He created this almost as a joke, as an analogy to the three estates in France before the French Revolution, where we had the first estate, which was the nobility, then we had the second estate, which was the clergy, and then we had the third estate, which was the majority of the population, which were neither nobility nor clergy. And so he said, well, we can kind of say that we have those Western first world countries that are almost like the nobility back then. Then we have those communist countries, which are kind of like the clergy back then. And then we have the vast rest of the world, which is like the third estate and who are poor and who are suffering. And probably most people forgot the notion of the second world, but the notions of the first world and third world are still used. However, it is not advised to still use them because they're not easily accepted. We rather talk about the global north and the global south these days, because particularly the third world, it often relates to paternalistic discourses. However, that being said, historically, using this notion of three worlds actually tells us something about the world. So we actually had this one block of countries which was called the First World, which is marked in blue here, mainly in North America, Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Australia and New Zealand, which were part of a military alliance. So they were military allies, but they also shared the same liberal economy, and they were the richest countries in the world, and they had something in common. Then we had, as the second world, the Soviet bloc, which also shared a common economic doctrine, shared a common economic space, and also shared a military alliance. And then we had the rest of the world, which was in general less rich than the aforementioned countries, and also less powerful. And some of these countries then later formed the non-aligned alliance, so the countries of an alliance of countries that were neither aligned with the Western countries nor with the Soviet bloc, in order to take their own stand. And there are still a lot of things that are debatable here. For example, you could discuss whether China should be marked in red or in green, because they were only very briefly really part of the Soviet bloc and already shifted away from the Soviet Union in the 1950s. And also ideologically, they were oftentimes closer to the third world, despite of being somehow Marxist-Leninist. And many other things are debatable here. Some countries shifted their lines over the course of time, but it says something about this world. And then, of course, mainly what was called the Second World collapsed. So all communist countries, almost all communist countries, gave up their economic order, and also their military pact collapsed, and so the Second World stopped to exist. And also at the same time, there were shifts in the relations between what was called the First World and the Third World, in the sense that many former Third World countries managed to industrialize or develop, and so it was not that clear a distinction anymore, particularly if we look to Southern East Asian states. And so one might think, well, now today we live in a globalized world where we only have one world left. And this is what also globalization means. However, here you also have to handle this notion of one world with care, and this map here represents why we should look at this with care. What we see here are representations of international trade. And what you probably see immediately, that we have three big poles of international trade. So there are 7 circles represented there, but 3 of them are really big, and the 3 that are really big are Western Europe, North America, and Asia. And then we have 4 rather small circles. We have the Eastern European and the former Soviet states, we have the Middle Eastern states, we have the African states, and we have the South American and Central American states. So they are far less included in international trade. And if we talk of a globalized economy and of global trade today, we mainly talk about trade between those 3 poles in Eastern Asia. It used to be mainly Japan and surrounding countries. Now the weight has shifted towards China and surrounding countries. We have Western Europe, and we have North America. So global trade is actually a trade between 3 poles. And if we look further there, we see that those circles that we have there are marked in 2 different colors. And the blue is the part of the trade, the international trade there, that is trans-regional, so really from Europe to North America or Eastern Asia or somewhere else. And the part that is marked in yellow means intra-regional trade. So, for example, when we speak about Europe, trade between European countries. And here you see that even in the present day globalized world, most of the trade still stays within the regions. Small side note here, we have to account for the fact that international means something very different in Europe than it does mean in the United States, because Europe, of course, is composed of many more states than North America, which basically is only 2 or 3 states. So the United States, Canada, and maybe Mexico. Sometimes Mexico is counted in, sometimes not. So there we have the fact that if there is a trade deal between a company in Eastern France and one in Western Germany, it's international trade. But if there's one between a company in California and New York, the distance is much further, but it's not international trade. So you have to think of this when you interpret this map. But however, you see that globalization is only in part true globalization. That's why you might also speak of regionalization. So international trade does expand, but it mostly expands within regions. And if it goes beyond regions, you might call it triadization, which refers to the triad of Western Europe, North America, and Eastern Asia. And so trade is triadized, so it's focused within these 3 poles. So you can kind of speak of a world where it's not the many worlds of 1400, it's not the European world of, let's say, 1800, it's not the 3 world of 1945 to 1990. It kind of became one world because all of these fell apart, but it's not a level playing field. So there's a lot of disbalance here. Last week I introduced the notion of capitalism, and this week I'll discuss capitalisms with an S at the end. So capitalism in plural. Thereby I'll of course pick up the thread from last week. I'll also answer some of the questions that you asked last week that I wasn't able to answer in the Q&A section. And of course also O'Brien and Williams discussed this in the textbook. One way to address capitalism is highlighting the fact that all capitalist economies face some of the same or very similar challenges, but however they can come to terms with them in different ways. If you remember what I said about capitalism last week, you could say that there are a number of things that you need in order to have a working capitalist economy. First of all, you of course need capital, which means you need some people or organizations to have a lot of disposable money that they can then turn into capital, which means they invest this in production to make profits and at the same time also foster production. Second, you need a labor force, so you need people who are willing to / are forced to engage in wage labor, which means to sell their labor power in order to survive or to have income or in order to buy stuff. Third, you also need demand, so there have to be people to buy the majority of the stuff that is produced. And then you can think of more things, so maybe some kind of legal and political framework that you need, and so on and so on. So there are certain requirements for capitalism to work. However, these challenges can take very different forms for different countries at different times. There might be a country that has an abundance in capital but a lack of labor force, or there might be a country where it's the other way around. There might be a country that has sufficient capital and sufficient labor force but just has problem to sell all their products, so they have a problem in demand. Or you can think of a million other ways in which these challenges are shaped at a certain time for a certain country. And even if the challenges are the same for 2 countries, it does not mean that they try to address them in the same ways. And because these challenges take different forms and can be addressed in different ways, we have a lot of different forms of capitalism. There are many different ways in which these forms of capitalism can be distinguished or categorized. For example, we have the notion of varieties of capitalism by Peter Hall. Then we have the different categories of welfare state introduced by Gösta Esping Andersen. Then we have the regulation school from France. We have different forms of institutionalism, and so on and so on. So there are many ways to categorize the different capitalisms. I don't want to go into all these differentiations and differentiate all these kind of theoretical approaches. I rather want to list a couple of aspects under which you can differentiate capitalisms. So first you can discuss different types of growth models. So as you remember, one of the main problems for capitalism is a lack in demand, so selling all the products that are produced. And there are a couple of ways in which this can be addressed. For example, there can be an export-driven model in which you just try to open as many foreign markets as you can and sell your stuff abroad. And this is, for example, what at the moment Germany or to some extent China do. So they are very much oriented towards export. On the other hand, you can also try to foster domestic demand. So you try to make sure that many people in your country have sufficient funds to buy stuff, and then you don't need to export all your products. In general, you can also say, well, is your economy more inwards oriented or is it more outwards oriented? All of this is capitalism, but it's a different kind of capitalism. Secondly, you can also discuss the sectoral composition of the economy. So in general, we talk of three sectors. We have the primary sector, which is agriculture, the secondary sector, which is industry, and the tertiary sector, which is the service sector. And the general idea is that there is a shift from the first to the second and then to the third sector. However, if you look at the actual countries, it's very complicated to make this case that is always exactly this way, because, for example, if you compare Germany to some other countries of a similar stage of development, let's say to the United Kingdom or France, you'll see that in Germany industry is still much more important than in some other countries, without you saying that Germany is less developed. So this is also a difference between the capitalisms. Third, you can also ask, okay, how big is the state sector, or are there sectors of the economy that are run by the state? For example, one sector that used to be run by the state in many countries was the air travel industry, and then it was privatized a lot of times. But you can also think of heavy industries that were run by the state in many Western countries for decades, and that are now mostly privatized. And this might be very different in different countries. And you can also think about the question whether the healthcare industry is run by the state or by state agency, or whether it's privatized, and this is different in different countries, different capitalist countries. Then you can think further about state intervention. So does the state let the market do what the market does, or does it try to intervene in the market? Does it try to help certain industries or certain corporations in national or international competition, or does it take a rather hands-off approach? You can also ask about unions. So you can generally ask, are they stronger or are they weaker in representing the interests of workers in general or of their members? You can ask, do they have the right to engage in collective bargaining? So can they negotiate the wage and the working conditions for all workers in the sector, for all of the members, or will this have to be done individually? All of this is different in different countries, and it makes a vast difference for how the whole economy works. You can also ask about corporatism, which means whether there is rather cooperative or rather conflictual interrelation between labor and capital, and also the government. So do trade unions and business organizations cooperate in saying, okay, we want a good competitive production for our country, or do they rather view themselves as opponents and saying, okay, we want lower wages or we want higher wages? And this can be very different at different times in different countries. You can discuss the welfare state. So for example, you can discuss the degree to which redistribution takes place. So does the state try to foster equality, or does it so to a much lesser degree and only tries to keep people from starving, or doesn't the state even do this? And then you can also ask about the universality of redistribution. So will every single person in the country benefit from the welfare state to the same extent, or are people who already had jobs in certain industries the only ones who benefit from it? And this is very different in different countries. You have the Scandinavian countries where you pretty much only have to be a legal resident in order to benefit quite well from redistribution. You have other countries in Southern Europe or in Japan where you have to have been employed in certain sectors of the economy in order to benefit from the welfare state at all or to a sufficient degree. So this is also very different. You can also ask about the labor market or the regulation of the labor market. So do we have a hire and fire market where businesses can get rid of their employees quite easily if they don't have enough orders to be profitable? Or is it rather hard for businesses to hire and fire their employees, which means that employees are safer in times of crisis, but of course it's harder for businesses, and businesses will think twice before they employ someone. And you can also ask, is there a big informal sector in the labor market, or is pretty much all of the labor market in the same way formalized and affected by regulations? You also have to ask about gender and family. So is there a strong gender division of labor, or do we have equality? Do women and men do the same jobs, or do women stay at home, not get paid, and do the reproductive work while the men do the wage labor? And with regard to family, you can ask, do we have a composition of the society in the nuclear family, so it's only mommy, daddy, and two children, or do extended families still play a major role? And this is quite different in different regions of the world. So let's say in India or Greece, the extended family plays a bigger role than in Sweden maybe. And this also has something to do with social security, because within families you often have the expectation that there will also be some economic redistribution taking place within families. So this is also important for capitalism, and this also is important because it of course also means the reproduction of the labor force, because the labor force will only be reproduced if people reproduce, which means have children. You can also ask about financialization, so about the relevance of financial markets for capitalism to work. And there are many more questions you can ask about political forms. So is there a liberal democracy or not? Do we have more bigger corporations, or do we have more small and medium-sized companies? Is the economy more focused on innovation, or is it more focused on producing well-known stable products? Do we have specific industrial policies? What's the relation between industry and banking? And so on and so on. So however you answer these questions, you still have capitalism, but you end up with a very different type of capitalism that might be more successful or less successful, and that might have very, very different consequences for the human beings that live in this society. And you can ask this question in a longitudinal fashion. So then you ask about developments in capitalism. There's this case made in the textbook that we used to have welfare states. So the focus of the state when it came to the economy in maybe the 1950s and 1960s was to produce mass welfare, so to make sure that everybody in the country benefits from capitalist developments and not only few. And then some people argue there was a shift to the competition state, where the focus is not so much general welfare in the society, but rather the competitiveness of the economy and of the country at all in the globalized economy. So then the state would argue, well, generalized welfare is nice and we kind of want that. However, we have to keep the cost of the welfare state low, because otherwise our industry cannot compete with the industries of China or the United States. So we have to tighten the belt in order to still be competitive. And this also then relates to a different way of looking at the welfare state and looking at unemployment maybe. So before you would have said, well, we want to make sure that people who lose their jobs don't lose all of their income and don't have to starve because we don't want extreme poverty. So you just have some redistributive payment. Now in a competitive state or competition state, you might say, we really don't want him to starve, we still don't want them to starve, but we don't give them money, but we give them re-education programs where they can train for a different sector. So if a steel worker gets unemployed, we want them to, don't know, take classes in computer programming to qualify for the labor market as the demand on the labor market is. So there is a shift. It was capitalism before, it still is capitalism, but it is a different time of capitalism. You can also ask this question in the type of a cross-section, so you don't look at the developments of countries over time, but rather you look at different countries at the same time, and then you can say, well, we had the Anglo-Saxon model, which is more liberalized, we have the Japanese model, which is more of a corporatist model, we have the Northern European states, which are export-oriented and have a strong welfare state. We have the Southern European model, which is rather focused on domestic demand and a not so strong welfare state. We have the Chinese model, which is autocratic and has a high degree of state intervention, is also oriented towards export. We have the Indian model, which is not so much focused on industry, but rather on service sector and on the IT sector. And all of these are capitalist models, but they answer the question that I just posed in different ways. And now some of you asked last week, well, if all these capitalist states are so different, what's the point in still calling them capitalist? If I want to use a word like capitalist, I want this to name something specific and not just something that applies to everything, because then it doesn't mean anything. And this, I think, is a very good point. However, I would still say that it's relevant to say that all of this is capitalism, because all of these economies and all of these different economic models, they still have to address, and they are different ways to address the very same problems and challenges, namely to have sufficient capital, to have sufficient labor power, to have sufficient demand, and to somehow also deal with the effects that capitalism has on the society in a wider sense, and for society not to degrade into some kind of chaos. So it's all different, but it's all capitalism, and it's an important point to say it's capitalism, particularly if you look at it from an international political economy perspective.